Well, good morning again. We are in the middle of a 4-week series on the book of Ruth, where we are exploring what it means to allow our relationships to grow. And all of our relationships, our friendships, our families, our love relationships, and our relationship with God. Now, if you weren't here last week, we started through the book of Ruth in chapter 1, and I gave you a kind of an assignment. I challenged you to read the book of Ruth all the way through, all 4 chapters, at least once during the week, each week during this series. Anybody do that? I won't make you raise your hand. I'll just assume all of you did, and so now you know the end of the story. If you haven't gotten a chance to do that yet, make sure you do that this week. But if you missed last week, let me give you a little bit of a recap. Last week, we got introduced to a Jewish family, a guy named Elimelech and his wife Naomi. They had 2 sons, and they were dealing with a famine in Bethlehem. And so they decided they were going to look for greener grass over in Moab, who was kind of in enemy territory. And so they left and went to Moab to try to find food. This is where every good love story starts, with a tragedy, because what happens is Elimelech dies. And then Naomi's 2 sons marry Moabite women, which would not have been part of the plan to begin with. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, then her 2 sons die. And she is left, Jewish mother-in-law, in a foreign country with 2 daughters-in-law. And she's lost everything. She has lost everything. She decides that it's time for her to go back home to Bethlehem, and so she tells her daughters-in-law, tell you what, stay here. You might have a chance to get remarried. You got some family here. Stay here, and I'll go back. There's nothing but death and destruction if you follow me. And so one of the daughters-in-law, Orpah, she stays behind, but Ruth, the Bible says, clings to Naomi, grabs onto her, goes all in. And Ruth, in this beautiful crescendo in chapter 1, says these words: "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." And so here is Naomi, Jewish mother-in-law, and Ruth, her Moabite daughter-in-law, heading back to Bethlehem to start over. And the truth we learned in chapter 1 is that no matter how bleak or how bitter or how abandoned we feel, we are never alone. That God always is at work in our lives, and that we are never without hope because of who God is. So chapter 2 of the book of Ruth is all about family. They are looking for food and for family, and they're not sure what to do. And I thought this was an especially good topic for us to talk about, especially with the holidays coming up, because a lot of you are going to be hanging out with family. And for some of you, that's going to be a really great thing, and you're really excited, and you can't wait to see some of these people. And some of you are like, oh, Lord. Some of you know exactly why it's been a year since you haven't seen those people. And some of you aren't really all that excited. I don't know what your holiday family plans are going to look like. Maybe they'll look something like this. Watch.
Amen.
Amen.
Catherine, this turkey tastes half as good as it looks. I think we're all in for a very big treat.
Save the neck for me, Clark.
Okay, Eddie.
Look at that.
Sorry.
Why are you crying? Huh?
I told you we put it in too early.
Oh, it's just a little dry. It's fine.
I told you.
Here's the heart. Aunt Bethany? Does your cat by any chance eat Jell-O?
I don't know about the cat, but I sure am enjoying it.
Now, I don't know what Christmas is going to look like at your house. I hope it looks a little better than that, but family is always a challenge, isn't it? We're gathered together and we're kind of forced into this dynamic, and we don't always agree and we don't always work well together. And today what we're seeing is Naomi and Ruth. They are the ultimate odd couple, returning to Bethlehem and trying to figure out family together. Listen to chapter 2, verse 1. It says, "Now Naomi had a relative, her husband on her husband's side, from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz." And so the narrator here is kind of introducing us for the very first time to this guy named Boaz. Now, if this were a Disney movie, this would be the knight in shining armor, the Prince Charming, to show up and save the day. He is the hero of the story. And you got to know a little something about family dynamics. It says that Boaz was a man of standing, which meant he probably had some wealth. He was probably a landowner. He was probably someone with a good reputation in the community. And so we're being introduced to Boaz because Boaz is related by clan to Naomi. Now, the family dynamics in that time start with, you're an individual, so you start with Naomi, and then Naomi is a part of a family, and that's where Naomi and Elimelech would be connected. And then that family was a part of a larger clan. And so Elimelech and Boaz were probably cousins or related in some way like that. And then that clan was a part of a larger tribe. And if you were a part of a clan with someone else, you had relationship and responsibility for those people. It wasn't just like these are the people who visit once a year. There was some relationship responsibility that you had for the people in your clan. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, it describes a law that was on the books in the Bible that said if your brother's wife died, you had to marry her, have a child with her, and name that child after your brother so that his family name would continue to live on. Because you're part of the same clan. And I've often thought, I love my brother, but probably not that much, right? I'd give him a ride to the airport. I might even help him move. Probably not, but maybe. But that's the kind of responsibility where they called that a kinsman redeemer. So hold on to that word. It'll be important here in a little bit. Look at verse 2. It says, Ruth said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, there's some master storytelling going on here by the narrator. Most people think Samuel wrote the book of Ruth. And so what he's describing here is the Jewish welfare system. The way it worked in beginning back, all the way back in Leviticus chapter 19, it says that you weren't allowed, when you harvested your crops, you weren't allowed to harvest the corners. And whatever you dropped, you had to leave on the ground so that the corners and those things that you dropped were available for foreigners, for travelers, for people in need, for the poor. And this was the Jewish welfare system. And so Ruth, knowing how this works, she says, listen, we got to eat. We got to find some way to eat. So I got to go out and find somebody's field where I can find favor with them. Because even though it was the law that you had to let foreigners and poor folks come and glean from your fields, let's be honest, single foreign women in a field were often victims more than they were being helped. And so you had to find somebody in whose eyes you found favor in order for you to take advantage of this. Now, the author does something wonderful. He uses the phrase, as it turned out. And let me tell you why. This is kind of author sarcasm here, a little hyperbole. You ever been to the movies and you're watching this movie where everything happens and all the coincidences and all the circumstances work out so perfectly that you're thinking, come on. It just does, this is just too perfect. It's just working out too well. And it's almost hard to believe the story because things are coming together. And so this is what the artist is trying to do. He's saying, as it happened, Ruth landed in Boaz's field. As it turned out, imagine that God is at work. God is in control. God has a plan. If John Wesley had written this story, he would have said, this is how God's prevenient grace works. That God is working in our lives. When we think we're all alone, when we think we're at our lowest point, when we think we've been abandoned, that God is working around us in ways we never see. As it turned out, God had a plan the whole time. I think that's pretty cool. Verse 4. Just then, there's another piece of sarcasm. Just then, Boaz arrives, as if anything else could have happened in this story. Just as Boaz arrives from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, he said. And they replied, the Lord bless you. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, whose young woman is that? The foreman replied, she is a Moabite who came from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So the first thing we learn about Boaz is that he's a man of integrity and great faith, right? You can tell a lot, not just from what comes out of somebody's mouth. First thing out of his mouth was the Lord bless you, right? But you can tell a lot from what your co-workers and employees say about you. Maybe I don't want to do that because some of my employees are, no. Anyway, you can tell a lot about a person by what your co-workers say about you. And their phrase wasn't, oh no, here comes the boss. But it was, the Lord bless you. And so he's a man of great faith. And then if this were a movie, this would be that moment where out of the corner of his eye, Boaz catches just a glimpse of Ruth. And all of a sudden, the music kicks up, and there's this heart-shaped glow around her. You know what I'm talking about, right? And there's like little lightning bolts and sparkles and rainbows coming out from every direction, and they're like their eyes lock on each other, and they can't see or hear anything else, and all of a sudden, all their legs just go bing, right? And it's just this beautiful moment. I imagine it might have sounded something like this.
Full of love, a heart full of song. So I'm doing everything all wrong. Oh God, for shame, I do not even know your name. Dear Mademoiselle, won't you say, will you tell?
Full of love, no fear, no regret.
My name is Marius Pontmercy.
And mine's Cosette.
Cosette, I don't know what to say.
Then make no sound.
I am lost.
I am found.
Anybody who said I could not put a Christmas Vacation clip and a clip from Les Mis in the same sermon, boom! And so Boaz, he sees Ruth, and he's like, who is this beauty? Who is this person? And notice how he says it. He doesn't just say, who is this? He says, whose is she? Who does she belong to? Because what Boaz knows is if I want to get next to Ruth, I'm going to have to go through the family, because family matters. Look at verse 8. They lay eyes on each other for the first time. And so Boaz goes up to Ruth and he says, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go glean in another field and go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she exclaimed, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Okay, so they lock eyes, right? And so Boaz gets up the courage, and he goes over and talks to Ruth. Now, I don't know if you can fully understand the dynamic of what's going on here, because Boaz is the rich landowner. And she is not even one of his servant girls. She's a foreigner. It'd been like, you remember when Jesus talked to the Samaritan woman at the well, and the disciples were like, oh, you can't do that. That would have been what this was like. And so you can just imagine Boaz, he's trying to impress her. He's trying to find something to say. And so he comes up to her with the world's worst pickup line ever. Right? He's all stumbling over her and he's saying, don't leave my field, don't go to that field, but stay in my field. But he uses the words, my daughter. Did you see that? He's inviting her already into the family, into community with him. He says, stay here. And that word stay here, remember in chapter 1 where Ruth clung to Naomi? It's the same word that's used here. He's not just saying you can hang out here if you want. He's saying, go all in with me. Stay with me forever. Become a part of who I am. And he said, I've taken away the danger. I know how vulnerable young women are in fields, especially foreign women. And so I've taken away the danger. I've told the men not to touch you. And then he goes even a step further. He starts breaking down all these social barriers. He says, when you get thirsty, go and drink water from the jars that the men have filled. Now, in this day, men and women would not have drunk from the same jars. That wouldn't have been okay. And often the women's jars were much farther away than the men's. And so he's saying, listen, my house, my rules. You get to do whatever you want. I'll give you whatever you need. And Ruth is blown away by his generosity. And she doesn't, a little confused as well, because she's a foreigner. So look what happens next, verse 11. Boaz replied, I've been told all about you and what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you left your father and mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to take refuge. She said, may I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord. You have given me comfort. You have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of even one of your servant girls. So his original pickup line, stay here, use my field, whatever you need, I'll get you whatever you need. It worked, right? She didn't go running off. She didn't ignore him. And so now he's doubling down. He's turning up the charm, right? He's like, oh, this is going well. I'm going to turn up the charm. And so he starts breaking down all sorts. He's already broken down social barriers. Now he's going to break down political and religious barriers for her. Listen to what he says. He gives her a traditional Jewish blessing that should never be offered for a foreigner, especially one from Moab. So he's breaking down religious barriers and political barriers as well. He says, you are under the wing of God. That was a metaphor that was only used for Israelites, only used for God's chosen people were those who were under God's wing. And so now if you're Boaz, maybe you were nervous a little bit ago, but now you're hitting it out of the park. I mean, you are hitting on all, you're saying all the right things. You can see the sparkle in her eyes. You can see her. She's breathing a little heavier. You got her right where you want her. And look what he does next. This is amazing. Verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. So what does Boaz do? He asks her out to dinner, right? This is a dinner date. They go on their first date right here. Now, some of you may remember some of your first dates and how awkward they may have been. And, what do we talk about? Where do we go? What's being expected and all of these kinds of things. Let me tell you about one of my first dates. One of the first dates that Julie and I went on, we were headed to the prom, all right? And so I have a prom picture here this is our prom picture. Yes, I had a mullet. And yes, I also had a cane because that's how I roll. I was just that cool. So anyway, I decided we're going to go to prom together. But before prom, we're going to go out to dinner together. And I had been to some fancy restaurants. My parents like to take us out to some fancy restaurants and have those experiences. But Julie had really grown up more in a meat and potatoes kind of family, eat simple, do those types of things. So we get to the restaurant and I am just king suave. I know everything. I'm telling her what fork to use. I'm telling her why there's 3 plates and all of this kind of stuff. And I'm telling her all of the restaurant etiquette and this is how you do this. And I am just being king of the world. So we eat our salads and we order our dinner, eat our salads, and then after the salads, they brought out the bread and they brought out this bowl of what looked like ice cream. And so Julie's like, "Wow, what's that?" And I said, "Well, that's sorbet, right? It's to cleanse your palate in between meals. I mean, if you were as cultured as I was, you would know these things." Right? And so I take my spoon and I stick it in there, stick it in my mouth, big old bite of butter. Not sorbet, butter. And my eyes went boom. And all I can hear is the waiter over here rolling on the floor, laughing at me like, "Look at this idiot." Now, I'm thankful that Boaz and Ruth's date went a little better than our first date. It went a little better than that. It wasn't quite as embarrassing, but so they had their first date. He says, "Here, come and have some roasted grain and some wine vinegar." Not exactly the Olive Garden, but it's all right. But look what he does. He invites her to the table with him. Not at the servant table, not even at the foreigner's table that wasn't even really a table, it's just a stump underneath a tree. But to the owner's table. And she sat with him and his guests and his workers. And it says he offered her some of the grain, which meant he served her. She didn't serve him. This is the Lord of the harvest serving a foreigner. If you were a first century reader or reading this in the original context, this would be blowing your mind right now. Verse 15, as she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Even if she gathers from among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, and then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried that back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today was Boaz." Oh, watch this. There's so much cool stuff going on here. So the date goes pretty well, right? So he decides he's not going to wait the obligatory 3 days to call. He's not going to send that text, the next night. He goes all in. The iron is hot, and he is jumping in. So he brings his wingmen with him, right? His workers and his harvesters. He says, listen, guys, here's the plan. When she goes out in the field, if she wants to glean outside the corners, I don't care. My field, my rules. You let her go wherever she wants. As a matter of fact, here's what I want you to do. When you gather up some of the grain, I want you to pull some of it out and kind of toss some her way. Make it easy for her. Make it easy for her. I'm trying to get to know this woman, all right? And so he breaks all of the rules for her. And by the time she's done that day, she's threshed this into barley, and it says she had an ephah. Do you know how much an ephah is? Yeah, I didn't either. I had to look it up. 30 to 50 pounds. 30 to 50 pounds, along with the leftovers that she still had from the Olive Garden, right? And she brings all of this back to Naomi. And the Bible says Naomi was blown away. Now, you got to remember where we last saw Naomi, right? The last time we saw Naomi at the end of chapter 1, she's saying, don't call me Naomi. Naomi meaning lovely. Call me Mara, which means bitter. She was angry at God, at her circumstances, at life. She was bitter at the world. And when Ruth walks in with all of this abundance, she immediately moves from bitter to blessed. Somebody here today needs to move from bitter to blessed. I'm going to let that sink in because I'm talking to you. So watch how the author kind of builds this story. This is really cool. This is masterful storytelling, because what the author does to us is he reminds us that Ruth has no idea who Boaz is. And Naomi has no idea where Ruth has been all day. All she knows is there's this giant store of food that is going to last them for months and months and months. And at the very last minute, where have you been working? How did this happen? At the very last moment, she says, it was Boaz. And in that moment, Naomi knew this was a work of God. Listen to what she says in verse 20. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead, she added. This man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. Remember that word? Our kinsman redeemers. And so in this moment, Naomi is coming back to faith because she's seeing what God is doing. She's recognizing that God is still good, even in the midst of her bitterness. And she uses a word for Boaz that we don't find used for other people very often. She uses the word kindness. He has not stopped showing kindness. The Hebrew word for kindness there is the word hesed. And hesed means loving kindness. It is infinite love. It is covenant loyalty. It's your love endures forever, the psalmist put it. This same word, hesed, translated into the Greek, would have been translated as agape, or God's perfect, unconditional love. So she recognizes this is a next level kind of love. And here's why this is important. Because at the end of the day, this is not just Ruth's story. It's not just Naomi's story. It's not just Boaz's story. But this is my story. This is your story. And this is God's story. It is the story of a God who always has a plan. A God who provides a kinsman redeemer to buy back those of us who couldn't fend for ourselves. So every time we see this word kinsman redeemer in the Bible, we need to ask ourselves, am I seeing Jesus in that? Is this a picture of Jesus? Is this what a foretelling of what Jesus had planned? Because a kinsman redeemer is a family member who has resources we need, and who's willing to redeem us from certain doom through the most intimate relationship there is, as Jesus calls us to be the bride of Christ. So, church, Ruth's story of this new family she got invited into, this community that she got accepted with, it's not just Ruth's story. This is our story. We were once lost, but now we're found. We were foreigners. We were those lost sheep, and Jesus came to look for us. This is the gospel message. I like to call it the gospel according to family. And here's the lessons I learned in the gospel according to family. Foreigners become family. Strangers get served at the table. The weak are protected under God's wings, and abundant grace is given to those in need. That's God's picture of family according to the gospel. Now, I don't know what your family looks like. When I put my family up against this picture of family, I think, whoop, got some work to do. But I want you to know that even if your birth family is kind of a mess, and all of ours are, you're part of another family. Here at the church, we call ourselves the family of God. And we're just a bunch of broken people who don't have it all together, don't have it all figured out. We're not always nice to each other. We don't always say the right things. We don't always do the right things. But we have been called to be a family who welcomes foreigners as one of their own. A family who invites strangers to be served at the table. We have been called to be a family who protects the weak under the wings of God. And we are the family who offers abundant grace to those in need. That's who we are. That's who we've been called to be. You know the old saying, you can pick your friends, but you're stuck with your family. Family, I'm glad to be stuck with you. I'm glad that you are stuck with me. And I'm glad that we serve a God who has called us together to love one another, to protect those in need, to reach out to the stranger, to be the hand of grace for all who are in need. This is what family looks like. My challenge to you is to live like a family.